A magnitude 6. 9 earthquake just tore through the earth beneath North Sumatra. And normally, a quake that size would be the only story in the region for days. But this one struck barely 24 hours after a deadly 7. 7 magnitude earthquake generated tsunami waves on the other side of the country, making this the third major earthquake to hit Indonesia in a single day. And yet, despite the size of this one, millions of people who felt it are describing it as gentle, almost rolling, and that's not a coincidence, that's physics. And it comes down to one number, depth. Let's break down exactly what happened. Thank you for joining me. I want to get right into this one because Indonesia is in the middle of a genuinely significant multi-event stretch of seismic activity right now. And I think it's important to walk through each piece carefully so you understand not just what happened, but why it happened the way it did, and why 2 earthquakes just a day apart and both in the same general country can look and feel completely different depending on one key factor buried, quite literally, in the data. Let's start with exactly what happened with this specific event. At 5:54 in the evening local time, an earthquake registering magnitude 6. 9 struck North Sumatra, Indonesia. The epicenter was located about 15 kilometers northwest of Pematangsiantar, a city of roughly 270,000 people, in the Simalungun Regency of North Sumatra. This quake was felt across a genuinely enormous area. Current estimates suggest something in the range of 11. 6 million people experienced moderate shaking, with millions more feeling lighter, shaking further from the epicenter, reaching into neighboring provinces including Aceh and West Sumatra. Now, here's the number that matters most in this entire story, the depth. This earthquake occurred at a depth of somewhere between roughly 99 and 183 kilometers, depending on which monitoring agency's estimate you're looking at, with the U.S. Geological Survey settling on a figure around 172 to 183 kilometers, and Indonesia's own BMKG agency initially reporting a slightly shallower but still very deep figure. I want to explain why there's some variation in that number across different agencies, because that's actually pretty normal in the immediate aftermath of a deep earthquake. Deep focus events are inherently a bit trickier to pin down precisely in the first minutes and hours because the seismic waves have traveled through so much more material before reaching the surface, and different networks and different modeling approaches can produce slightly different depth estimates until the data gets fully reconciled. But regardless of exactly which figure you use, every single estimate puts this earthquake solidly in what seismologists classify as a deep, or at minimum, a very deep intermediate earthquake. And that classification changes everything about how this event actually played out for the people who felt it. Let's talk about why depth matters so much, because I think this is genuinely the most important concept to understand in today's breakdown. When an earthquake happens close to the surface, the seismic energy has very little rock and material to pass through before it reaches you. Which means shallow earthquakes tend to produce sharp, intense, sometimes violent shaking directly above the epicenter, even at more moderate magnitudes. But when an earthquake happens 100, 150, close to 200 kilometers down, that energy has an enormous amount of material to travel through before it ever reaches the surface. And it loses a significant amount of its intensity along that journey. That energy also spreads out over a much wider area as it travels upward and outward, which is exactly why we're talking about millions of people feeling this earthquake across a huge stretch of Sumatra, but feeling it as lighter, more rolling, less violent shaking, rather than the kind of sharp, damaging jolt you'd expect from a shallow earthquake of the same magnitude. This is precisely why, even though a 6.9 is a genuinely large earthquake in absolute terms, releasing a significant amount of energy, this particular event does not appear to have caused significant damage or casualties. The U.S. Geological Survey issued what's called a green alert for this earthquake, which is their lowest tier of estimated impact, essentially indicating a low likelihood of significant casualties or economic losses. That's a direct, predictable consequence of the depth, not a matter of luck. Deep earthquakes of this magnitude, even when felt by millions, typically do not produce the kind of surface damage that a shallow earthquake of similar or even considerably smaller size would produce. I also want to address tsunami risk directly, because I know that's a natural question anytime an earthquake happens in Indonesia, given the country's history. Indonesia's Meteorological and Geophysical Agency, BMKG, formally confirmed there was no tsunami threat from this specific earthquake. And again, this connects directly back to depth. Tsunamis are generated primarily by shallow undersea earthquakes that cause significant vertical displacement of the seafloor, essentially shoving a massive volume of ocean water upward or downward all at once. A deep earthquake occurring under land, 150 or more kilometers down, simply doesn't produce that kind of seafloor displacement. The mechanism required to generate a tsunami just isn't present in an event like this one, regardless of how large the magnitude reading is. Now let's talk about why Indonesia produces this kind of deep earthquake in the first place, because I think the tectonic setting here is genuinely fascinating, and it's central to understanding both this earthquake and the broader pattern of activity we've seen across the country over just the last day or so. Indonesia sits at one of the most geologically active junctions on the entire planet, right along the Pacific Ring of Fire, at the convergent boundary, where the Indo-Australian tectonic plate is being forced underneath the Eurasian plate, a process called subduction. As that oceanic plate dives down and under the neighboring plate, it doesn't just disappear quietly, it continues to bend, deform, and fracture as it descends deeper and deeper into the mantle. And that ongoing deformation is exactly what produces earthquakes, not just at shallow depths near the surface where the plates first make contact, but at a whole range of depths as that subducting slab continues its descent, sometimes producing significant earthquakes well over 100 kilometers down, deep within the slab itself, far below where the actual plate boundary interface sits. This is a genuinely different earthquake-generating mechanism than what produced the other major earthquake Indonesia experienced just the day before this one. Let's talk about that event too, because I think understanding both together really tells the complete story of what's been unfolding across the country. About 24 hours before this 6. 9 struck North Sumatra, a much larger and far more destructive magnitude. 7 earthquakes struck the Flores region in a completely different part of Indonesia, hundreds of miles away. That earthquake was shallow, and unlike the Sumatra event we're discussing today, it did generate a tsunami, with monitoring stations recording waves up to nearly a meter high at some coastal locations. That Flores earthquake has been directly linked to significant loss of life, with at least 47 deaths confirmed in its aftermath, and it was followed by its own sequence of significant aftershocks in the hours that followed. So, within the span of about a day, Indonesia experienced 2 major magnitude 6+ earthquakes on entirely separate fault systems in entirely separate parts of the country. One shallow and destructive with a tsunami, the other deep and thankfully far less impactful despite being a comparable, even larger magnitude. I want to be very clear about something important here. These 2 earthquakes are not mechanically connected to each other. They occurred on separate structures, hundreds of miles apart, and one did not trigger the other in any direct causal sense. What connects them isn't a shared fault line, it's the country's overall tectonic setting. Indonesia sits along thousands of kilometers of active subduction zone boundary, and it is simply one of the most seismically active nations on the planet, capable of producing multiple significant independent earthquakes within a short window of time, purely as a matter of the sheer scale and activity level of the tectonic boundary running through the entire archipelago. Let's dig a little deeper into the specific tectonics beneath Sumatra, because this island in particular has an extraordinarily well-documented and closely studied seismic history. Sumatra sits along what's known as the Sunda megathrust, the primary subduction zone boundary running along the western edge of the island. And this is the same general tectonic system responsible for one of the most devastating earthquakes and tsunamis in modern recorded history, the massive magnitude 9. One earthquake off the coast of Sumatra in December of 2004, which triggered a tsunami that killed hundreds of thousands of people across the Indian Ocean region. That's obviously a very different scale and depth of event compared to what we're discussing today. The 2004 earthquake was an enormous, shallow megathrust rupture along the plate interface itself. But it underscores just how significant and how closely monitored this entire region's tectonics are, precisely because of that history. Today's Deep 6. 9 earthquake reflects a different, though related part of that same broader subduction system, the ongoing internal deformation of the Indo-Australian plate as it continues its long, slow descent beneath Sumatra and the surrounding region. This kind of deep, intraslab seismicity happens regularly throughout this part of Indonesia. It's a normal, expected part of how this subduction zone behaves, even though any individual event, especially one large enough to be felt by millions of people, understandably draws significant attention and concern when it happens. Let's talk about what's expected in the coming hours and days following an earthquake like this one. Indonesian authorities have advised residents across the affected area to remain alert for the possibility of aftershocks, and that guidance is standard and appropriate following any earthquake of this magnitude, regardless of depth. I do want to note that deep earthquakes like this one, because of the different mechanism producing them, sometimes produce somewhat different aftershock behavior compared to shallow crustal earthquakes. But continued monitoring and caution remain the sensible approach regardless. Local officials and BMKG have also provided some practical guidance for residents in the affected region that I think is worth sharing, because it applies broadly anytime you're dealing with the aftermath of a significant, widely felt earthquake. Before going to sleep or leaving the house, take a moment to inspect for any newly formed cracks in load-bearing walls, structural pillars, or concrete foundations, since these can sometimes only become apparent after the fact. Avoid lingering near balconies, brick fences, or aging concrete structures that could be more vulnerable during any aftershock activity. And it's worth taking a moment to secure heavy furniture, bookshelves, wardrobes, anything that could topple over if additional shaking occurs. Officials have also emphasized relying on official channels, specifically BMKG's own monitoring and alert systems, for accurate, verified information, rather than unverified reports that can spread quickly on social media in the hours following any significant earthquake. I want to take a moment here to talk about the human experience of living through a stretch like this, because I think it's easy to get lost purely in the seismological details and lose sight of what it's actually like on the ground. Experiencing one significant, widely felt earthquake is unsettling enough, but experiencing a second major earthquake within 24 hours, even one that ultimately proves far less damaging, understandably compounds anxiety and uncertainty for people across the region, especially so soon after news of the destructive Flores earthquake and its tsunami and loss of life would have been spreading. If you have friends, family, or connections anywhere across Indonesia right now, this is exactly the kind of moment where checking in on them matters, not just for the practical reassurance of confirming they're safe, but for the simple human comfort of knowing someone else is thinking of you during an unsettling stretch like this. Let's talk a bit more broadly about deep focus and intermediate depth earthquakes in general, because I think this is a genuinely useful concept to understand any time you hear about a major earthquake occurring somewhere in the world, and it applies well beyond just this one event in Sumatra. Seismologists generally classify earthquakes into three depth categories: shallow earthquakes occurring less than about 70 kilometers down, intermediate depth earthquakes occurring between roughly 70 and 300 kilometers down, and deep focus earthquakes occurring anywhere from 300 kilometers all the way down to nearly 700 kilometers beneath the surface, in some of the most extreme cases recorded anywhere on the planet. Today's Sumatra earthquake, sitting somewhere in the range of 100 to 180 kilometers depending on the specific estimate, falls squarely into that intermediate category, deep enough to significantly reduce surface impact and damage potential compared to a shallow event of the same size, but still well within a depth range capable of producing widespread felt shaking across a very large geographic area, exactly what we saw here. This is actually a really useful thing to keep in mind. Anytime a large magnitude earthquake makes headlines somewhere in the world, the magnitude number alone doesn't tell you the whole story, and it certainly doesn't tell you how damaging or dangerous a particular earthquake is likely to be. Depth is just as critical a piece of the puzzle, and understanding that relationship helps explain why you'll sometimes see a magnitude 5-point-something earthquake cause significant destruction because it struck at a shallow depth directly beneath a populated area, while a magnitude 6-point-something or even 7-point-something earthquake, like today's event, can be felt by millions of people and still result in minimal damage, purely because of how deep it occurred. Let's zoom out one more time and talk about what this cluster of activity, the Flores earthquake and tsunami, its aftershocks, and now this deep 6.9 in North Sumatra tells us about the overall picture in Indonesia right now. This is a country that logs significant seismic activity on a near constant basis. It's one of the most tectonically active nations on the planet, sitting at the junction of multiple major plate boundaries. And stretches of clustered activity like we've seen over the last day or so, while genuinely significant and worth close attention and monitoring, are also, in a broader sense, consistent with the kind of seismic environment this entire region exists within. That's not meant to diminish the real impact and tragedy of the Flores earthquake specifically, which did cause real loss of life and real destruction, but it is meant to provide honest context for today's Sumatra event specifically, which, thanks largely to its depth, appears to represent a significant seismic event without a significant human toll. So let me bring this together and give you the summary of everything we've covered today. A magnitude 6.9 earthquake struck North Sumatra, Indonesia, near the city of Pematangsiantar at a substantial depth estimated between roughly 100 and 180 kilometers, making it a deep, intermediate focus earthquake rather than a shallow, more immediately destructive event. Despite being felt by an estimated 6 million people or more across a wide stretch of Sumatra, this depth meant the shaking experienced at the surface was generally light to moderate rather than severe. And there is no indication of significant damage or casualties associated with this specific event, and no tsunami threat was generated, consistent with what we'd expect from an earthquake this deep. This event came just about 24 hours after a much more destructive, shallow magnitude 7 earthquake struck the Flores region of Indonesia, generating a real tsunami and resulting in real loss of life, making this the third significant magnitude 6+ earthquake to affect the country within a single day, a reflection of just how seismically active this entire archipelago nation genuinely is, sitting as it does along one of the most active tectonic boundaries anywhere on Earth. I'll continue to keep an eye on this evolving situation across Indonesia and bring you updates as warranted. the same way I do with any significant seismic activity on this channel. If you're anywhere across the affected region right now, please stay alert for the possibility of continued aftershocks. Follow guidance from BMKG and local officials, and take a moment to check your home for any damage that might not have been immediately obvious. And if you have loved ones anywhere in Indonesia, please reach out and check on them. A stretch like this, with multiple significant earthquakes in close succession, is a genuinely unsettling thing to live through, regardless of how the seismology ultimately played out for any one specific event. Thank you so much for being here for this breakdown. I know it's a lot of science to walk through, but I think understanding the why behind an earthquake like this genuinely helps make sense of what can otherwise feel like a confusing and frightening string of headlines. If you found this helpful, please share it with anyone who'd benefit from understanding this a little better, and please, above everything else, be safe. I'll see you in the next update.